We're live, Aaron.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe, well, and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today's topic couldn't be more timely. The 2024 presidential elections, what happened and why. I really do believe that we need to exercise some humility here. I mean, I think that not even the famed oracle at Delphi, Pythia, could probably, reading the best of entrails, could probably predict where America goes from here. And I think we really do need sharp, trenchant, and tough analysis now, at least in this session, rather than advocacy. And I can think of no two better humans on the planet, the best in the biz in terms of political analysis to help guide us through these questions, the past, the present, and then we're going to take a stab at the future. Let me introduce them very briefly. S.E. Cupp is a nationally syndicated columnist, television host, and author. She's a political commentator for CNN and host of the syndicated show Battleground. She's been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Oprah Daily, Glamour, and dozens of other publications. Inestimable S.E. Cupp. Norman Ornstein, the inestimable, is an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a contributing editor and writer for The Atlantic and has been an election eve analyst for CBS News and BBC. He's also chairman emeritus of the Campaign Legal Center. He was a political science professor at Johns Hopkins University and the Catholic University of America for 15 years. Welcome to both of you, and welcome to Carnegie Connects. I want to begin, first of all, with the past, what happened and why. Not surprisingly, Democrats are arguing about the why. Let me just read you this exchange between Bernie Sanders and DNC Chair Jamie Harrison. Quote, it should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and they want change, and they're right. To which DNC Chair Jimmy Harrison replied about Bernie Sanders' comments that straight up, quote, straight up BS, unquote, arguing that the Biden-Harris administration had brought about a slew of pro-worker reforms, including creating new jobs through major legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act. So the analysis of the why seems to break down into two camps. The structuralists who argue that no Democrat could have won, with 75% of the country arguing that it's moving in the wrong direction, and a President, Joe Biden, who had an approval rating, I guess, just below 40% in an election year. And then there are those who argue, well, no, a Democrat could have won, bad timing, short campaign, bad messaging. So let me start there with you, S.E. You had a terrific piece in the Daily News on November 6th. I'd recommend it to everyone, talking about losses, Republican losses. You're a movement conservative and a former Republican. Losses in 2008 and 2012, two decent, moral, wonderful humans, John McCain and Mitt Romney. And when you say, and I'll quote, and when you're sent to the woodshed by American voters as we were, you go and think about what you've done. But now it's the Democrats' turn to learn from this. So let me start with you, S.E. What exactly happened in your view and why?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. There's a few factors. Let me start by saying I covered this election in a way I have not before. Rather than cover it from CNN in New York or Washington from inside a studio, I went to a swing state, Pennsylvania, and covered it through the eyes of swing state voters in the 7 battleground states. And all I did was talk to voters and reporters who knew voters all over these 7 swing states about what they wanted and what was bothering them. And the consensus over hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews with voters over 6 months was real clear. They were telling us in their own words, this was not a mystery. The 3 things bothering them most were the economy, immigration, and crime. Now, that didn't mean we didn't hear from voters who said abortion was a big factor, democracy was a big factor, but this was the consistent message. I think had Democrats been listening to those voters and believing those voters, I think a Democrat could have won. And so I disagree with Bernie Sanders in terms of the voters they didn't court or the voters they're no longer speaking to. I think they courted all kinds of voters. And I know they went to, all 7 of these states. There was no Hillary Clinton issue this time where they just didn't take Wisconsin or Michigan that seriously. Kamala Harris went everywhere. So did her surrogates. I think she was courting working class voters and all kinds of voters. But there's 3 things to look at, speaking from experience, having gone through the Republican autopsy. There's 3 things to look at here: candidate, message, and policy. I don't think the candidate was the best. And I'm not talking about Joe Biden. Joe Biden definitely wasn't the best and should not have run. And I think had Democrats run a primary, Kamala Harris is not the person that would have emerged as the best matchup against Trump. I'm not saying she's not qualified. She was. And I think she ran a great campaign given the circumstances. But I don't think they picked the candidate for the moment to match Trump. The messaging was wrong. When you're telling voters the economy is strong as hell, and maybe you just don't feel it yet because of lagging indicators, this consoles no one. And it does nothing to make people feel like, well, he gets me. He knows what I'm going through. Same on immigration. They said the migrant crisis wasn't a crisis until they started admitting it was. And same with crime. They said you are safer in your town and your city than you were 4 years ago. That is not true. And more importantly, that's not how people feel. As a woman walking through the world 40 plus years, I know when I feel safe and when I don't. And I don't feel safe today in major cities. And I work among lots of them. So the messaging was wrong. Telling voters their feelings are wrong is terrible politics. The third thing, policy, is the hardest for any party to reconcile and examine. And I know this because Republicans were loath to do it as well in 2020. But there's some bad policies that Democrats have to accept are not working the way they believe that they are working. Some bad inflationary economic policy, obviously bad policy on the border, and some bad soft on crime policy. These aren't perceptions. These are policies that aren't working. American voters aren't stupid. They know they're not working. It's common sense to a lot of them. So those 3 things are what I would tell Democrats to examine now: the candidate, the messaging, and the policy. It's not the kinds of voters they were going after, I don't think. But that's a hard process. That's a hard thing to do. I thought some good came out of it when we did it, but Donald Trump didn't care about it, so it was ignored. But it was a useful exercise for us when we went through it, and I think it'd be useful again.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really trenchant and maybe indictment is too strong word, critique. I mean, wrong candidate, wrong message, wrong policy. I mean, that I guess would require.
It's a recipe.
Yeah, I mean, it's an RX for a complete rebuild. Over to you, Norm. How do you see it?
So first, let me just talk a little bit about the last point. If let's say that Joe Biden had said 2 years ago, I'm not going to run, we would have had 20 Democratic candidates, a zoo. They would have ripped each other apart and probably denied the nomination to the next in line, a woman of color, which wouldn't have done great things for the enthusiasm of the base. So I'm not sure that even that is an argument or an area worth examining at this point. I would expand on what Essie said in a couple of ways. The first is the roots of right-wing populism go back a long ways. And it was a struggle within the Republican Party going back to the 1920s, the America First movement, Father Coughlin. You look at the battles that Robert Taft, representing the sort of darker side, ran against Tom Dewey and Wendell Willkie, and the establishment prevailed until the establishment no longer prevailed. At the same time, we've had a war on expertise and this notion that the people who are governing us, the elites, have screwed it up royally. And I could take that back, for example, to the Tea Party movement and the financial collapse in 2008. I will say from that I think the roots of some of the problems that Democrats have came when Barack Obama, in what I would view as the biggest mistake of his presidency, didn't take a single financial executive, frog march that individual at least to a trial, and point to where the problems were. Because what most Americans saw was we lost our homes, we got caught in a horrible situation, may have lost our jobs. The people who did this not only walked away scot-free, they got big bonuses out of it. And all of that just sort of builds. Then I think there's something that we cannot ignore, which is COVID and the aftermath of COVID. And it's not just inflation. You know, when I saw Glenn Youngkin win the governorship in Virginia, what Youngkin was able to do, I think more than anything else, was to focus on the turmoil and discontent so many families had for 2 years from COVID. You have a family with two people working to make ends meet. One of them can't work because the kids don't have any place to go because the schools are closed. Or you got 7 people in a tiny apartment 24/7 for a year or two. And the perception of Democrats and of the elites, the scientists, was it's science. That's what we got to do. No sense of empathy, no talking it through with people about the difficult trade-offs. And I think all of that played into the discontent. And then you've got the supply chains and everything else triggering inflation. And the problem that people have and politicians are going to have with inflation is when it goes up, you notice it. When it comes back down, you don't notice it as much. Gasoline is $4.50 a gallon. Every week when you fill up, you're enraged. When it goes down to $2.90 a gallon, it's just not on your mind anymore in the same way. So you've got all of those factors playing out. And then I want to add one other element to this, which is so many people who voted for Trump knew who he was and what he represented. I think there was a reaction of, yeah, he talks a lot of shit, but, it's not going to be any different than the first term. And some of that burden I put on a press corps that did sanewash this campaign. Some of it was just the dilemma that occurs when you're trying to cover an election and you have an abnormal situation, but you're used to covering normality. So you force it into a normal line. And it's not that everybody reads the New York Times or AP or watches CNN, but they're the opinion leaders, and that's what trickles out to people. So they ignored what Trump was saying. The irony in all of this, and I'm sure we will get to it, is that the guy who lied 33,000 times in his first term told the truth about one set of elements, what he would do in a second term. And it got brushed aside by too many, and we'll find out what that truth-telling actually means not very long from now.
Right. So neither of you are firmly convinced that that no matter what Democrat ran, the fact that most of the country believed it was headed in the wrong direction, and Joe Biden's approval ratings in an election year were low, unprecedented to win an election with somewhere below 40%. Had Joe Biden decided to do a James Polk, who's the only president in American history to declare at the beginning of his first term that it would only serve one, do you think a different candidate, SC, with a different message and different policies could have beat Trump?
I do. But they would have had to have run a very different campaign, acknowledging some of that pain that I was talking about.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, I'm a movement conservative. I gave Joe Biden my vote in 2020, the first time I voted for a Democrat, because I believed it was existentially important to move past Trump. I did it, though, with the explicit understanding that he'd be a one-term president, because that's what he talked about. He talked about being a transitional president, not a transformational president. That's what I signed up for. And I thought it was really, patriotic of him to sort of set those terms. Now, as the course of his term went on, he backed away from that. And when you're not going to telegraph to voters what is going to happen, and you don't give them time to condition an environment for other people to emerge, they're thinking Joe Biden's going to run again.
Yeah.
You can't sneak it on them at the last minute. Well, here's your new candidate. I believe that had Joe Biden said immediately, I'm not running again, and let's have a good old-fashioned primary that begins years before the actual primary, where people are coming up and coming in and coming out and talking about what they would do. And I believe that could have produced a better candidate, and it would have sidestepped the thing that Norm was talking about. And he's totally right. You can't pass over Kamala Harris on the bottom of the ticket. Just optically, and that's the wrong thing to do. But had he decided, I'm not running again, that could have opened some doors for other people who wanted to have a different kind of conversation going up against Trump 2.0.
Yeah.
I would just
before we move to, yeah, go ahead, Norm. Sorry.
Just to react to that in a couple of ways. First, I think this idea of the circular firing squad that Democrats are doing right now is utterly stupid. It doesn't tell them much of anything.
Yeah.
There's also what I believe is a lame duck fallacy, which is that a president who says he's only going to serve one term is unleashed and can do whatever they want. It doesn't work that way. It's quite possible that we could have had a process that would have resulted in, say, a Gavin Newsom being the nominee, who would have campaigned in a very different way. But in the end, the way it worked out when Biden dropped and Harris moved in, and you had this surge in enthusiasm in the Democrats' base, and she ran a very good campaign. We have to look beyond the candidate to look at the roots of this. And I must say, I thought she was going to win for a couple of prime reasons. One is they had the turnout machine that was the best ever. And what we've learned is, and what the Republicans did was Trump put in his daughter-in-law to siphon away the turnout money to pay for his lawyers, and they put Elon Musk in charge. And you would think that would make a difference. You're not going to get your turnout to work the way you want it if people don't want to vote for you or are discontented. The second was, I really thought the Madison Square Garden hate fest was going to make a difference, and that it did not. That Latino voters, Puerto Rican voters in swing states didn't pay attention to that. That tells us something as well. I don't think it means that we're seeing a realignment. They're going to learn something different. There was, by the way, a headline in the Detroit News just a couple of days ago. Muslim Americans who voted for Trump expressing some concern over his early appointments and moves. Duh.
No kidding, right?
Yeah. We're going to have a lot of that, I suspect.
Right.
Well, that's not what I voted for.
Right. Well, there may be buyer's remorse. Before we get to the present, though, I want to ask you another question on messaging. Politico reported that the abortion issue was by far the most prevalent topic in Democratic messaging in 2024, beating out healthcare, the economy, and immigration. And it doesn't appear that the Republican position on abortion didn't hurt them as much as would have been anticipated. Maybe it's because Trump seemed to moderate his view. I don't know. Why didn't the abortion issue play the way Democrats thought it would? Or for that matter, the democracy color between the lines issue of a president who respected norms and institutions. That issue didn't play well either. People seem to literally ignore it, and obviously operated on much more basic personal, economic, and security issues. How did the Democrats fall into that trap?
Well, I think those two issues did work for Democratic voters. Those were motivators for Democratic voters, just as they were in the midterms. And I don't think Democrats were wrong to wrap their arms around those two issues. They were motivating their base. But I've been saying for a while now, to care about things like democracy, I'll put that in its own category, you have to be sitting from a pretty privileged place. I'm
Yeah.
in my home studio in a nice town in Connecticut. My bills are paid. I'm not worried about opioids ravaging my town or crime or a migrant crisis overtaking my town's resources. I'm not economically anxious. I have the luxury of caring about democracy, and I do deeply. It's again why I couldn't vote for Donald Trump. But not everyone has the luxury. Once they're if their basic needs aren't being met, they don't get to democracy. They might not even get to a thing as important as women's reproductive rights.
Yeah.
That's a single issue for a lot of voters, but it's not a single issue for voters who can't pay their bills, who haven't gotten a raise in 5 years, who can't get a job, who can't buy a car, who can't buy a home, who are dealing with drugs and crime and all the other things. It really does come down to, well, I could afford more stuff 4 years ago. And the judgment that they would face from Democrats, oh, your economic grievance is why, which they thought was code for racism or sexism or some other bigoted impulse, was really, really damaging and really dismissive. The people I talked to who were talking about economic grievances weren't going to Trump rallies. They weren't listening to the Nelk boys. These weren't MAGA diehards. They were just normal people. And I think the reason the Madison Square Garden thing didn't penetrate the way a lot of us thought it would was, people tuned that out. I mean, the same people tuned out migrants eating pets. They didn't care about that either. The garbage that Trump was pushing, they didn't care about. And some of the hyperventilating that Democrats were pushing, they didn't care about that either. It wasn't reaching them because, to Norm's point, they weren't watching CNN or reading the New York Times. They weren't, in many cases, reading or watching anything. They were on Facebook, living their lives. So I think there is this over-indexing of the role that the media plays and just how much we can do to frame the issues correctly and what should be a priority for people. I don't know anyone in the media who isn't sitting from a place of some kind of privilege. And that kind of always gets us off our mark when we're doing stuff like this.
It's a fascinating point. It's a good segue, though, to turn to the present. Norm, you want to weigh in? Go ahead.
I think it's important to talk about a couple of other things. One is the midterm fallacy. You know, Republicans won a huge victory in 1994 and thought that that was their roadmap to victory.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton won re-election in 1996. They won a huge victory in 2010 and were convinced that Barack Obama would be a one-term president. They doubled down on what they were doing and they lost in the next election. Democrats thought that they had defied the red wave in 2022 on the abortion issue, and that was their ticket to success in 2024. But there's another point that has to be made here. We are still an evenly divided country. As the final votes come in, it's pretty clear that Trump, first of all, while winning the popular vote, it's going to be by a whisker and he will get below a majority. Right. The swing states went his way, but as they usually do, they move in one direction, and there was a trend just enough to make all of that work. We are still in a very different place, and now we're going to see, as we look to the present, what the consequences are of many of these policies that people did not put at the top of their priority list. Mm-hmm. That includes, by the way, the turmoil of storms, violent storms, insurance companies leaving, and the burdens that are going to be on people that weren't at the top of their minds because for most people, the hurricane didn't hit them directly. Right. And the abortion issue right now didn't hit them directly for just the reasons that S.E. said.
All right, so let's turn to the present. Again, it's a good segue. If the policies aren't working, maybe the personnel and the people are. Writing in the Times, Peter Baker wrote that he used the term hostile takeover in the three government institutions where in Trump 1.0, he felt most angered and frustrated: justice, the intelligence community, and the Pentagon. And I'll remind you something in Trump 1.0, it was Jeff Sessions, it was Jim Mattis, and it was Dan Coates. Now it's Matt Gaetz, it's Hegseth, and it's Tulsi Gabbard. So I'm assuming, based on on both of your analysis, that most of his voters aren't going to care about these appointments either. Is that an accurate assessment?
Norm, why don't you go ahead first?
They won't care about them until they some of them are in office and actually start to implement policies.
Yeah.
To pick one example, let's say that Pete Hegseth makes it. We know that a couple of things have been pledged. The first is that Trump will be allowed to use the military to put down those he disagrees with and the dissidents, those he's called the enemy within. He will invoke the Insurrection Act, most likely. The second, and in some ways more unsettling, is the willingness to use the military as part of this plan to detain and then deport 12 million or maybe more people who are either in this country illegally or are here legally, but he will deem them to be illegal. And Mike Madrid, who's one of the best analysts of the Latino community, has said that the last time we had a mass deportation, half the ones deported were American citizens. You can imagine rounding that you've got people in the military who have no training in this, who are told to go out there and find people to be detained and deported. There's going to be somebody jogging down the street who looks like a Hispanic. They'll pull that person in. Maybe he or she forgot the green card, and they may be gone. So at the moment, most people are not paying attention to who Trump is picking, and that's partly because they haven't gotten in office yet. But a lot of them are going to get there, and the consequences, I think, are going to be severe. And if it's not Matt Gaetz, one of the things that Trump has done, he did this before in 2016. He flooded the zone with scandals, and they washed over each other until they all became meaningless. Now he's picking, to choose a term, a basket of deplorables, and knowing that the Senate, the Republican Senate, may, get backbones up enough to reject one or two, but they're not going to reject them all. And if he really wants somebody who's going to be rejected by the Senate, he will use this device of the recess appointment. So most of these people are going to make it. And while people don't care right now, I believe they will care significantly when they're in office.
Before I go to USC, let me ask, normally stay with you on the issue of personnel. You've had relatively nice things to say about Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff. Is that because you think she's going to provide adult supervision and curtail some of Trump's worst instincts? She'll run a more efficient ship? I mean,
I think Susie Wiles is much more of a traditional conservative. She is more pragmatic. We know from the campaign that she tried very hard to curb some of Trump's wildest statements and actions. What we also know is that when Trump and his friend Boris Epstein concocted the plan to pick Matt Gaetz, they were on Trump's plane and Susie was in a different part of the plane. But then, she went along with it. The one concession she got from Trump was, I get to control who goes into the Oval Office to meet with you. Well, that's fine, except most of his meetings are going to be in the dining room at Mar-a-Lago. And believe me, she's not going to be standing there with the waiters to say to crazy people, including, by the way, foreign agents, no, you can't sit with the president. So I'm not sure that this is going to end well for Susie Wiles.
Yeah. SE, over to you on the issue of personnel as policy. What about these appointments?
Well, this is the other side of the coin. The voters I talked to did not say, not a single person of hundreds, if not thousands of voters that we talked to, said, I'm voting for Donald Trump to go get revenge on his enemies through the DOJ. Not a one.
Yeah.
Not one voter said, I'm voting for Donald Trump because I want RFK Jr. to get fluoride out of the water or end vaccines. Not a one. Not one person said, I'm voting for Donald Trump so that he can put someone like Tulsi Gabbard in who is pro-Putin and pro-Assad. Not a one. No one said, I want someone to go into defense to fight wokeism in our military. None of these things mattered to his own voters. So what Trump and Republicans did really well was listen to voters to get elected. If they're going to stop now that he is elected and just go on about Trump's business, because these are Trump appointments for Trump, for his own edification. They're not for his voters. His voters didn't ask for any of that. His voters might support him because a lot of them will support anything, but there were a lot of voters who didn't vote for the personality. They voted for the policy they expect to get on the economy, crime, and immigration. If they get that policy, it won't matter who delivered it. They won't care who was in charge of Homeland Security or whatever. They'll be fine with that. But if these people go in with what Trump is saying they're going in to do, what they're saying they are going in to do, I think you are going to see some kind of backlash in midterms and then over the course of the 4 years.
A word before we leave personnel, because I want to talk to you about the Senate and get your reaction to whether or not that body is going to serve, even though it's got a Republican majority as a constraint, is the Elon Musk phenomenon. I mean, this is something that is, in my 27 years in government, never has an individual citizen, a private citizen, had the kind of influence that Elon Musk has. And never has a private citizen who has 6 major companies with billions of dollars of government contracts. He's under federal regulation scrutiny by justice, the FAA, either being investigated or fined. What does the Elon Musk, and forget the DOGE for a minute, the Department of Government Efficiency, what does Elon Musk mean? It's not just a talking point or a throwaway, is it?
No, it's certainly not that. And this is deeply troubling. It's not the first time in our history that we've had the richest in the society having enormous influence. We can remember the Gilded Age. We're in a supercharged Gilded Age right now because it's not just Musk. It's Peter Thiel. It's Bill Ackman. It's David Sachs. It's
Bezos.
It's and Jeff Bezos, who followed on keeping the Washington Post from endorsing, which is more symbolic than anything else, but then doing a sycophantic congratulations to Trump. It's what we know will happen now. We've already seen that Comcast is going to spin off its networks. And they're doing that to get distance because they have all kinds of other regulatory issues and they are kowtowing to Trump. And a part of that is, as we can herald it as we look to the future, what Tim Snyder and others have said about autocracies, which is it's not just what they do, it's people anticipating what they're going to do and changing their behavior as a consequence. For Musk, and with Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy heading up this operation, which for Musk means, he's talked about we're going to cut $2 trillion from the government. That's easy, which they will soon discover is ridiculous. But it's also the prime objective, as you suggested, is going after the agencies that regulate him, that are investigating him, and cutting them off and basically blowing them up to keep all of that from happening. We are going to see, I think, a group of billionaires who are delighted because they're going to thrive under Trump. More and more tax cuts, less and less regulation. Many of them, the Silicon Valley ones, I should add, who believe that they live behind gated communities. And if there's turmoil otherwise, it won't matter much to them. And we're going to see if there's any backlash to that for just the reasons that Essie said. A bunch of voters who didn't vote for this.
Essie, do you have a thought on Musk?
Ditto to what Norm said, and I'm very worried about. I'm worried about the cronyism. That won't be new. It won't be new, period, and it won't be new for a Trump administration. But on hyperdrive, this time around. And when you make someone like Elon Musk head of this very, maybe even toothless department, I don't know what this is going to do. We could form a department of government.
Yeah. And
whatever.
he can't actually, if he makes it a government department, he's going to have to divest himself of his interests. So
that's right. So
yeah.
that's exactly. And so I think that it might be toothless for some very important reasons. But when you put a very public, very powerful, very wealthy person as the face of this, to Norm's point, it's the threat of it that becomes the most powerful part of it. I don't know what he and Vivek are actually going to do day to day, and not point out the irony of appointing two people and creating a new bureaucratic department to end bureaucratic waste. But the threat of what they will do is, I think, the more powerful part, because Trump has been very clear that he is going to install people for revenge. Elon Musk seems very on board with this. That is very much Elon Musk's own MO. Before he got close to Trump, he was known to have allegedly fired people at his companies who publicly disagreed with him or critiqued him. You know, the free speech warrior does not like speech that is not kind about him and his product. So, yeah, I worry about that. I worry about those relationships, and I worry about the Republicans who will not complain about those relationships being
Right.
I don't know how long this will last, by the way. Musk is the alpha male. He's always been, he uses his money. Nobody crosses him. And he's not the alpha male here, but he's going to, he believes he can be the alpha male and make Trump the beta one.
No,
and that's
Trump
not
will tire of him. You're right.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
But before we move to the future, I want to ask you about the Senate. Should we count on the Senate serving as any sort of brake or constraint if in fact there are no FBI investigations, clearances of appointees? Will the Senate demand them? Is this a rubber stamp and or recess appointments?
I'm afraid it's more of the latter. The fact that all three candidates for majority leader sort of jumped on board the idea of, well, maybe we will be okay with recess appointments, which is their most critical power, really, showed that there are very few restraints that will be applied. Now, will we have a nomination or two go down? Probably yes. Will we have a couple of dissidents? Yeah, I believe what we're going to see with the confirmation process is what we saw in Trump's first term, where Mitch McConnell gave Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins a pass as long as he knew that they still had 50 votes. And if they didn't, Brett Kavanaugh being an example, there was no pass anymore. And I don't see any others beyond those two who are going to be, dissidents in any significant respect. They're all in. It's a cult.
Okay, let's, in the time that remains, let's talk about the future. Steve Felstein, a colleague of mine at Carnegie, wrote an interesting piece. He asks 4 questions about how Trump is actually going to govern. Number 1, will Trump weaponize the administration to persecute his opponents? That's 1. Number 2, will he erode military civilian norms by deploying the military for domestic purposes? That's 2. Number 3, will he use his power in any way to restrict civil society? That's 3. And 4, will he sideline U.S. institutions seeking to restrict or restrain the aggrandizement of presidential power? Those are the 4 questions.
What is this?
I'm just curious. Is this for each of you? Is this a we'll have to see, or is this, yes, this is going to happen, it's only a matter of degree? Where do you, you have to divine or predict the future like Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi, but where are you on this? We'll see, maybe yes, maybe no, or it's all going to play out. It's just a question. To use a subtitle of one of your books, Norm, it's worse than you think. I don't want to panic. I don't think the Republic is collapsing. It's a big country. We have a long history. I've got a profound faith still in the American Republic, but to what degree, and I hate the word game changer, inflection point, all of that, watershed, all of it. Life's not about transformations. It's usually a series of transactions which can result in significant change. So put this Trump presidency in 2.0 in with that sort of perspective. Am I whistling past the graveyard here for each of you?
Well, okay, I'll start. I think the initial appointments suggests that it could be worse than we have thought. And with that, and that means a yes, perhaps a little qualified on all four of those. But he is going to try and silence his enemies. We already know he's made a pledge that he will try and bring retired military people back into active service so that they can be court-martialed for treason. I mean, that's insane. But if Pete Hegseth makes it, they're going to try some of that, along with weeding out the woke military. We know that he is going to try to quell dissent. But there's a fifth question there that needs to be a part of this, and it gets back to where Essie started. What will happen with the economy? If we get these, first of all, if they start to do these mass deportations, we're going to have huge turmoil in the economy, a lot of it in red states. Meatpacking plants are going to close down because they don't have anybody to work there anymore. We're going to have no inspections. We're going to have all kinds of outbreaks of foodborne diseases. If RFK Jr. steps in and does what he says he's going to do, we're going to start to have outbreaks of measles. They're going to disrupt all kinds of elements of the economy. And the tariffs, creating a trade war, are going to have raging inflation. And then you've got the tax cuts in the first few months, not just what will be an extra $4 trillion hit on the deficit from extension of his 2017 tax cuts, but another several trillion, all of which will trigger inflation. How will his voters react to that? How will the voters who thought his foreign policy was actually going to, stick it to Joe Biden for what he did with Israel, for example, react if there's turmoil in the world and if we get dragged into it in some fashion? And then we get to the cutting edge of this. Will he react as autocrats usually do when there's intense turmoil, including from your own base, which is to crack down on it? Or will they begin to back off and say, oops, we went too far? And I'm afraid I'm a little bit more in the former camp than in the latter camp.
Yeah. Essie?
Yeah, I agree with everything Norm said. I will add some maybe sense of reassurance that we still have a lot of Democratic state houses and Democratic state legislatures. And because of federalism, we still, give the states a lot of power. I think Norm's right that Trump is most risky at his economic policy. If he's going to go down, it's going to be because of his economic policy. And I put immigration in that. But for some of the other stuff, like floating this idea that he's going to end the Department of Education, that makes a lot of people go, what? Oh my God, that is awful. But just to calm people down, 90% of the funding comes from the states for our schools. The DOE does not set curriculum. It doesn't set school policy, which you could argue is a good reason to shut it down. What's it doing? Well, there's some really important things that it does, like administer grants to impoverished schools, helps cover the cost of special education, which is important for me and my child. So it does some important things. But there's also just a lot that happens at the state level, and you could kind of go department by department, issue by issue to look at this. And so while I have all the fears that Norm has with both personnel and policy, and especially in those moments where he feels threatened, how is he going to react? I have all of those fears. And while I don't think we're going to have the checks and balances that we want in Congress, I think nationally at the state level, we will have some checks and balances, and there will be resistance that you, the American citizen, will feel more at the state level than what's happening, in the White House.
There's another way to look at this, Aaron, which is there are two models here. There's the Putin model and there's the Orban model. My guess is we're probably going to be a little bit closer to the Orban model. And what we're going to see is using the IRS and the forces of government to cow dissent. We'll see media outlets that are suddenly faced with huge tax bills that have a couple of their executives indicted. We're going to see the judiciary used as a Potemkin village of an independent judiciary. We're going to see corruption done in a way that is not through necessarily the use of brute force. But given Donald Trump, I don't rule out that there will be some elements of that Putin model as well. Maybe not throwing ballet stars who don't like the war out of their sixth floor apartment windows, but using the military along with some of these slightly more subtle ways of enforcing a different reality.
Right. And if both of you are right and you focused largely on policy and the reality that if policies don't deliver, then those who craft them have some measure of accountability, perhaps not while they're governing, but certainly in 2026 and 2028. It's the first time since the 70s, I think, that we've had three presidents, although one has done a Grover Cleveland, in 8 years, which reflects a certain dynamic of change in the American electorate. And trifectas don't necessarily, House, Senate, and the White House, even with the popular vote, don't necessarily reflect continued success at the polls, the midterms, or in the next presidential election. We're out of time. We could have gone on for another hour, 45 minutes. It would have been great. I want to thank both of you. You make an enormous amount of sense. And I really appreciate your clarity and your honesty, and above all, your integrity. We need critical voices who are honest and clear to bring the kind of analysis that is required. I just hope that it would find a way to pervade beyond Washington and our particular media echo chamber. But thanks again, SC and Norm. Till
Thanks,
next
Aaron.
time.
Thanks,
you,
Norm.
Take care.
Thank you, SE.